Well, earlier you said that each culture should have its philosopher, and then the intellectuals should be the people who more or less put the philosophy into action.
That's
Now,
right.
it seems to me that there's another side, another issue of this too. What about science?
Well, science is a very recent phenomenon. Science is, of course, the product of the 19th century, of the Industrial Revolution, of capitalism, of a free society. Now, I must mention the third type of man who has been very seldom the ruler of history or of any society. He has been the forgotten and exploited man of history. That is the man who lives by means of reason. That is the man who, in his psychoepistemology, is not guided by his immediate perceptions nor by his emotions, but by logic, by his concepts, by reason. That is the man whom I call the producer. He is the man who creates not only the material values of mankind, but also and above all the intellectual, the philosophical values. The first producer in history, in this higher sense of the word, would be Aristotle, who was the first rational philosopher. Scientists certainly should be producers. They are the men who are supposed to be, and by the nature of their profession, have to deal with the study of reality by means of using reason. Unfortunately, today, most of them, outside of their own narrow profession, outside of their laboratory, in effect, are turning more mystical than any other group of men. The fault is partly theirs, but predominantly it's the fault of philosophers. Since there is no philosophical guidance at all, many scientists today are turning to a witch doctrine type of mysticism of their own.
You mentioned producers. Aside from those people who give us intellectual products, what about the businessman? You've talked about capitalism. I'd like to know his role in this.
Well, the businessman also is as recent a product as the intellectual. Before the birth of capitalism, there were no professional businessmen, and there were no professional intellectuals. Both the mind and material production and trade were enslaved and ruled by the various combinations of Attilas and witch doctors, which means by a powerful government, by an absolutist type of government, whether it was the feudal absolutism or the absolute monarchies of Europe of the past Renaissance period. In any case, the producers of material goods, the traders, and the producers of ideas, the teachers, philosophers, the early scientists, were men without official status, without a profession, and at the total mercy of the political rulers, which means at the mercy of rule by force. It is only since the Industrial Revolution, the birth of a free society, the society of capitalism, that there was a new class of men, which is the free producers of material goods, the businessmen, the industrialists. They, of course, are the producers in the strictest sense of the word, or should be, but they are the greatest victims of today's society. They are the ones who have been betrayed by modern intellectuals, and in this sense, both businessmen and intellectuals will commit suicide by destroying each other, and the fault belongs to the intellectuals. The businessman is the man who has to use his mind to deal with reality, to study facts, to produce material goods. He is the man who serves as the transmission belt of the discoveries of science and carries the products of science to all levels of society. He is the one who takes the invention of a theoretical scientist or of an inventor, transforms them into useful products, and putting them into mass production makes them available to all levels of society. The businessman is the man who has achieved the enormous, historically miraculous rise in the standard of living of mankind during the 19th century. He is the one who has lived up to the role of a producer, to the role of a rational, creative man. But the intellectuals have never given him credit for it, have regarded him as if he were an Attila, and being afraid of freedom themselves have been looking from the start of the Industrial Revolution for some form of an Attila to protect them, the intellectuals, against the free market of ideas.
Well, you know, you've been talking about the bankruptcy of our modern intellectuals, and I know that in your most recent book, this is really a manifesto to a group that you call the New Intellectuals. Would you mind telling me just who they are, in your own words, and how they differ from the old-style intellectuals?
Well, since the old-style, the presently existing intellectuals, have declared their own bankruptcy by abandoning the intellect, what we need today, what I call the new intellectual, would be any man or woman who is willing to think. Meaning, any man or woman who knows that man's life must be guided by reason, by the intellect, not by feelings, wishes, whims, or mystic revelations. Any man or woman who values his life and who does not want to give in to today's cult of despair, cynicism, and impotence, and does not intend to give up the world to the dark ages and to the rule of the collectivist brute.
Well, the new intellectual, then, you would imagine would be a fairly recent phenomenon. Have there been any of this type in the past that you can remember that you would like to point out?
What type I would hold as the new intellectual?
Right.
Well, only to name a few historical examples in the most general way. Aristotle is the man I would take as the first intellectual in history, in the best sense of the word. The founding fathers were America's first intellectuals because they were thinkers who were also men of actions. They were the men who knew that reason is man's guide to reality, that man can achieve an ideal way of life on earth by means of his reason, and that man requires freedom in order to be guided by his judgment and his mind, that men should deal with one another by trade, by persuasion, but not by force and compulsion. It's the founding fathers who established in the United States of America the first and only free society in history, and the economic system, which was the corollary of the American political system, was capitalism, the system of total, unregulated, laissez-faire capitalism. This was the basic principle of the American way of life or the American political system. However, in practice, it has never yet been practiced. A total separation of government and economics had not been established from the first. It was implied in principle, but certain loopholes or contradictions were still allowed into the American setup and into the American Constitution, which permitted collectivist influences to undermine the American way of life, and today it is practically collapsing. Today there is nothing left except an undefined tradition. The active intellectual direction of our society at present is anti-American and anti-intellectual. It is going back to the primordial mysticism of dictatorships and rule by force. Therefore, the new intellectuals now should be those men who will stand up for two fundamental values: the value of their own life, of their inalienable rights, of their self-esteem, their independence, and the value of a non-coercive, free society in which men do not use force against one another.